Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, let's take a little break from an Alabama Senate race and talk a little bit about presidents with some historical perspective. One of the criticisms or concerns about President Trump when as a candidate, then ultimately as president, is this, since he's not really philosophically a conservative. I think he has some kind of policy instincts in a conservative direction, and that's a good thing. But during his campaign, he wasn't particularly focused on the spend side, the
No.
growth of government. It was about reducing taxes and growing the economy. But what about the spend side? Are we going to see an effort to limit government? And frankly, to one surprise, they've done a pretty good job, the Trump administration, of defanging the administrative state or making progress in that direction in the first year. This is perhaps the underreported story of Trump's first 11 months in office, which is virtually zero new regulations added to the Federal Register. And how much of a sea change is that? Well, in the last 2 decades, Republican presidents and Democrat presidents, the average has been 11,000 new regulations added to the Federal Register annually.
Wow.
So that's a serious accomplishment that's under talked about, including by erstwhile conservatives like me. And so I want to make note of it, but get some historical perspective on presidents' accomplishment in the direction of reining in Leviathan, this $4 trillion a year central government we have, and untold trillions more of costs and obligations it imposes. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Ivan Eland. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Peace and Liberty, Center on Peace and Liberty, and he's the author of a new book, 11 Presidents, Promises versus Results in Achieving Limited Government. Ivan, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So, for conservatives, when you say, well, greatest president ever, or certainly greatest president of the 20th century, Ronald Reagan, of course, that's the first name that comes to mind. As a child of the 80s, first name that comes to my mind. Although probably the president of the 20th century who deserves more credit than even Reagan was Reagan's kind of presidential idol, Calvin Coolidge. Give us, just start there, the Reagan-Coolidge connection, and who was actually more successful in limiting government during their time?
Well, of course, Coolidge, and I would modify that by the Harding-Coolidge period, because Harding started it all and Coolidge continued it, a very fine job of it. But they actually cut domestic spending, and they cut it after a war, which is very difficult to do. When we have a big war, or even small wars, the government goes up both in terms of defense spending, but also in terms of government programs. Interest groups find that their lot improves during warfare, and they like to continue the subsidies or the favorable regulation afterwards. And so it's very unusual to cut spending. And, of course, Coolidge was able to cut taxes, but he made sure that he cut spending. Unfortunately, in Reagan's case, and he set the recent model for George W. Bush and probably now Trump, is we cut taxes, but we increase spending. And because if you don't do anything, the government is on autopilot to increase spending. You can cut some of it, but they didn't really cut much in Reagan's time because government increased not only in the absolute sense, but as a portion of the GDP. So what we had was yawning deficits, and of course Ronald Reagan had the biggest, the smallest net tax cut of any Republican in the post-World War II history. And the reason for that is he had to raise taxes in 6 of 8 years to make up for the yawning deficit. So somebody either have to raise taxes, or you have to print money, or you have to borrow a lot of money and pay interest. So this idea that we're going to cut taxes, not cut spending, and we're going to get it back, really, the empirical record is not very good. Tax cuts paying for themselves.
But to be fair to Reagan and to other presidents too, you have to factor in Congress when you talk about their records. And I believe in 6 of the 8 years of Reagan's presidency, he actually proposed budgets that spent less than Congress, but for most of his term, he had to deal with Tip O'Neill.
Well, of course, he should have factored that in when he cut taxes. I think he should. It's also a quick case of priorities. If people come in and say spending is my number one priority, Reagan had a tremendous mandate when he first started, and if he hadn't started out on the taxes, if he started on the spending, of course, even the Democrats are going to vote to reduce taxes if we have a big surplus, because politicians don't like surpluses. And so I think it's a question of priorities among these presidents. And I'm not necessarily dragging Reagan through the mud, but I think, this model where we cut taxes, we don't get around to doing the spending. We should cut spending first, and then we can certainly lower taxes when we pay down the debt. But of course, we have such a tremendous debt, $20 trillion. We probably should run surpluses for a while to pay down that debt before we cut taxes.
There's an idea.
I would just say don't do anything with taxes now, and let's cut spending for a while. Let's see how that works. We never do that because, very frankly, politicians can get elected with cutting taxes, but spending cuts. People like their programs. They don't really want to pay for them. And, of course, the people that really suffer are the kids and the grandkids, either people who can't vote or people who are not born yet, who have to pay all the interest on this huge debt that we have.
Now, in your book, you focused on Herbert Hoover as well, and you said that he didn't do enough to end the Depression. Can you explain that?
Well, I think he actually did too much to end the Depression. I think prior to Herbert Hoover, we all always focus on FDR, but Herbert Hoover was a progressive Republican, just like FDR was a progressive Democrat. And what Hoover did was came in and he started when the economy went south, starting with the Wall Street plunge in 1929. Hoover really started jawboning all the businesses not to lower their prices, not to keep wages high and keep prices high so that the things wouldn't plunge, and therefore that violated the free market. And a lot of Hoover was very proud that wages didn't go down and everything, but when you have a recession, wages need to go down for a while so you can re-equilibrate the economy, and therefore what Herbert Hoover did was very counterproductive. And also, of course, he started a bunch of government programs, which FDR really expanded that idea when he got into office. So I think Herbert Hoover probably created the Depression from a mundane recession. And, of course, then FDR made the Depression worse. With his policies.
So we've run through a couple of the less successful presidents on the score of limiting government. From the 20th century forward, the 11 presidents that you reviewed, who would you say had the best record at actually limiting the size and scope of the federal government?
Well, certainly Harding and Coolidge are the stars in that regard, because they lowered domestic spending after a war. Which is extremely hard to do, and they did cut spending as well as taxes, and I think that's the model. I think we have to pay for the government that we have, and we can't go into these idea that we're going to have tax cuts that pay for themselves. Then now you may get a little bit of revenue back because of the economy goes better, but historically it really hasn't panned out. We've got all these dynamic scoring models or whatever. You just have to look at history. And I think we need to quit doing that. People love tax cuts. I understand that. But, we racked up $20 trillion of debt, plus actually more than that now. And, it's headed north there rather than south. And unfortunately, Trump, during his business career, was called the king of debt. And so I'm not sure he's going to be one to cut spending unless the Republican Congress can make him do that. But almost nobody... This is how we define conservatism nowadays, is you cut taxes, and I think that's a mistake. I think we have to define it as cutting spending, because that's the main thing. And we can always cut taxes, but I think you have to own up and pay for the government that you have. And if people want big government, then they're going to have to pay for it. But I think that's the biggest weapon that you have, is you say, listen, we've got to pay for the government that we have, so let's cut the government. And I was the only person in Washington, I think, that liked the sequestration, where you had to make automatic cuts in the government. Now, they didn't, when they put that in, actually the author, that was Obama, but he didn't really want to put that in. He said, well, if we don't make other cuts, we're going to have to cut it across the board as a threat. Well, of course, then they got in loggerheads. The Democrats and Republicans couldn't, agree on what cuts to make, so they did this sequestration, and we've been doing that. And it has been restraining spending almost accidentally. Now, it's not cutting spending, but it's restraining spending. And I think that's what you really need, is you need some sort of a decision rule that says, listen, everybody's got to sacrifice here. We have to have cuts across the board. That's the only way you can politically cut spending. And they've done it. At least they've restrained it. And I think they probably should go further than that than they have.
So, Ivan, through your research and studying these 11 presidents, who do you think was the worst for the economy?
Well, I guess you'd probably have to say, Herbert Hoover, since he inadvertently caused the Great Depression by, he was the first president that thought the government ought to ensure everybody a job, full employment. And, of course, the Democrats picked this up, and other presidents and Republicans have since picked it up, that the government was responsible for getting people a job. Now, that seems like a wonderful idea, but in the old days, for most of the U.S. history, people didn't expect the government to get you a job. They expected that the government would provide security and maybe build some roads and canals and that sort of thing. But, when you start doing that, the government gets involved. It doesn't do a very good job of it. So I think Herbert Hoover really started the ball rolling in making the government responsible for getting everybody a job, because I think when the government tries to do that, it interferes too much with the economy. And I think that brought a whole cascade of problems, including the Great Depression and all the big government that we have now.
What would you say is the single best example of reducing the size and scope of government and accomplished by the 11 presidents? The single best the single greatest accomplishment of reducing spending?
Well, I think Harding and Coolidge, as I mentioned, reducing domestic spending after World War I. I think also both Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton after the Cold War was over. And of course, there are events that
But I mean, a specific thing. So when you're talking about Clinton and Gingrich, you're talking about welfare reform?
Well, I think that was one big thing that Clinton did that went against his party. And I think sometimes we look at party labels too much, and we should really look at the figures and facts as well. And I think we haven't had many successes in reducing government, but I think that was one as well. Yes.
All right. He is Ivan Eland. He is the senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty. The book 11 Presidents: Promises versus Results in Achieving Limited Government. Ivan, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Before